Brothers and sisters and friends, I won't mind if you continue reading, that's not going to disturb me. Well, we'll go a bit easy on you for the first 10 minutes or so of this session before we sort of drill down a little bit. This session is designed to look at chapters 10 to 17. Now, it's huge in proportion, so I can't do more than give you really an overview and just here and there talk about some very significant themes. So we can't do what we'd like to do, but you've got all the information that you can follow through the notes. Will tell you exactly, well, I'm reading out of my margin. They're there for you to follow if you wish. Let's just take you back to this imagery again of the telescopic view of the apocalypse, and it's unfolding in the continuous historic interpretation from AD 96. Now, thus far we've looked at the seals in part, the trumpets in part, and we come down now to this period. We briefly considered the vials of the wrath of God in chapter 16. Well, I want to just step back to the end of the 6th trumpet, because that's the end of chapter 9. And the end of chapter 9 says in verse 21 that when the 6th angel had done his work, and that was the work of the 4 waves of the Turkomans who came from the east, and they'd done their work, and it culminated, as we saw, in the overthrow of Constantinople and the end of the Eastern Empire in 1453. What happened as a result of that? Well, verse 21 says, "Neither repented they of their murders, nor of their sorceries, nor of their fornication, nor of their thefts." In other words, the judgments that God brought upon the Eastern Empire did not bring an end to the system. It continued on. It continued to persecute those who opposed it. Right? They didn't repent of that. So if you were one of those who were a believer and you understood the apocalypse and you knew you were in this period of time, what would be the best thing that God, through Christ, could do for you? Well, chapter 10. That's why chapter 10 is where it is. He gives them a marvellous vision of glory here in chapter 10. And that vision shows that these people who are being persecuted by the system, which has a long time to go yet, these people are ultimately going to be involved in its destruction. That's the encouragement that he gives them. The time will come and it will be destroyed and you are going to be involved. Now I want to just sort of work ourselves into Revelation chapter 10. It's an absolutely fabulous chapter. But it's a very important chapter in relation to our personal involvement in this work. And I want to show you that as we proceed. So here we are with this period here, the end of the 6th trumpet, and it's a period of time when many of the believers would be in turmoil in their mind. Well, where's this all going? Well, here's your answer. Placed to show the destruction of the Roman system, which was not accomplished by the 6th trumpet. The 5th trumpet lasted 300 years, and the 6th over 391 years. All this time, the true servants of God were suffering at the hands of the Roman Catholic system. Before Constantinople in 1453 did not bring about any change for believers, the papacy in the West continued to persecute them. There were grounds for despondency. Revelation 10 is God's answer for that. So this is what we see in Revelation 10. This is the vision of what we call the rainbowed angel. The angel of the bow, as Brother Thomas calls it in Eureka. Now, it's very important to understand that when you see this angel of the bow in verses 1 and 2, he's actually at the end of his military career. You do not get the rainbow until the storm has passed. Right? The rainbow comes at the end of the storm. That's why when you look at this vision, I want to read the first 2 verses to you. What you're going to see is something like this depiction on the screen. This is the best that human artists, very deficient by the way, the best that human artists, this is my brother's depiction so I can blame him. This is the vision of the march, of the rainbowed angel, who's finished his march when we read about him in chapter 10 verses 1 and 2. So let's read these 2 verses. "I saw another mighty angel come down from heaven, clothed with a cloud, And it should say, this is the Greek, and the rainbow was upon his head. The reference there is back to chapter 4, verse 3. There's another rainbow which has a predominant colour. There's 7 colours in the rainbow, but there's a predominant colour. Emerald green. Why? Well, emerald green, or green, is the biblical colour for immortality, for life. You know, when things are green, they're usually alive, aren't they? This is immortality. So this is a company of people. They're immortal people. It says, the rainbow was upon his head, and his face was as it were the sun, and his feet as pillars of fire. And he had in his hand a little book, actually should be scroll, a little scroll open. And he set his right foot upon the sea, and his left foot on the earth. So he's got his right foot on the sea, which is the Mediterranean Sea, and his left foot upon the Roman earth, as we've been considering. So there are 2 stages to the work of judgment that this angel has been involved in. Now it's actually, of course, a reference to Christ and his saints. And all of those symbols speak eloquently of that. And I haven't got time to go into all that now, but you can fold this up, you'll find all of these symbols speak eloquently. Christ with his saints going forth to bring judgment upon the nations. We see him here at the end of his career, because there's a rainbow. The rainbow symbolises what? Peace. Like after the flood. The judgments are past, see? End of a career. That's why the little scroll is open. When you open a scroll or unseal a scroll, it means that you've actually fulfilled the contents of it. It's unrolled. Okay? That's this marvellous vision that's portrayed. So think about if you were one of these people suffering at the hands of the Roman Catholic system beyond 1453, you've got some comfort, haven't you? Comfort because the day will come and the divine judgments will sweep that system aside. So what's the sea and the earth here? Well, the sea is a reference to the Mediterranean Sea. Clearly, if that's the case. To the nations of the Mediterranean region. And actually pointing forward to Christ's victory over the Gogian Confederacy in the Battle of Armageddon and those subsequent battles in this local area to establish his power there. But for the next 40 years, he has to contend with those nations who will not submit to his rule. Psalm 2 is all about that, and there are other prophecies that deal with that. So he has to finally put his left foot on the earth, the Roman earth. That's a reference to victory over the European nations and over the papacy in due course. It will take 40 years to accomplish all of that. This little open scroll is very, very important in the scheme of it. Brother Thomas says this in Eureka Volume 3. He says this little scroll is the most important fragment of the Apocalypse. Now, I don't think most people would believe that, would they? This little scroll in the hand of the angel is the most important fragment of the Apocalypse. It contains the catastrophe of the plot, without which all the rest would be of little interest to the believer. In other words, it contains the judgments over a period of 40 years that will see the establishment of the kingdom of God. That's why it's so critical to the Apocalypse. Now, what about the length of this scroll? Again in Eureka, Brother Thomas says this. It is a little scroll of judgment. The scroll is little, not the judgment. Okay? The scroll might be short, but not the judgments. The scroll unrolled is not long. The 7-sealed scroll, extending from John's day to the time of the dead, or the resurrection, is long. Upon its roll are inscribed judicial events extending over nearly 18 centuries, obviously written in 1860, so you'd say that differently now. This is not a little scroll, but a very long one. A scroll extended gives us the idea of length, and this is representative of time. A little scroll is a short time in which things written therein are to be accomplished, a period, say, of 40 years, according to the testimony of Micah chapter 7, verses 14 to 17. Now, there are 2 very simple proofs that there will be a 40-year period. One's in the Old Testament, Micah 7, the other one is in Revelation 14, and we'll come to that a little later on. The one in Micah 7 says that when Israel are returning under Elijah in the second exodus of Israel, the nations will see things happening around Israel according to them coming out of the land of Egypt. In other words, the second exodus is the same length as the first exodus. The first Exodus was 40 years under Moses. The second Exodus will be 40 years under Elijah, according to the number of the days that they came out of Egypt. 40 years. Now that's the proof that Brother Thomas uses, but there is other proof that I'm going to show you. So what we have here, brethren and sisters and friends, is this. Some of you may have seen this chart before. It's an attempt to consolidate, to distill down to a simple format what's going to happen over a period of 50 years. Now, I'm not going to do this here, but you can prove, and I know you can prove, from Ezekiel, that there will be a 50-year period from the resurrection of the dead to the time that Christ walks his bride around the completed house of prayer for all nations. If I have 15 minutes, I can prove that to you, and if you weren't convinced, you will do what others have done. They've come to me and said, Jim, I can't really see it. You know what I said? Go home, get Brother Sully's book on the temple out and look at chapter 2. That's the chapter 2. Open your Bible and do some study for yourself. You know, every single one of them has come back to me and said, you know, Jim, Brother Sully's right. Yeah, I know he's right. He is right. There will be a 50-year period from the resurrection of the dead to the time when Christ has his universal rule, the temple's complete, and he walks his bride around it, which is the subject matter of Ezekiel chapter 40, verses 1 to 3. Okay? So, if there is a 40-year period of judgment, as I'm going to demonstrate to you in a minute, where would you put that? Well, the second half, wouldn't you? That's right. That leaves you 10 years. 10 years, brothers and sisters. And you know, there are a massive number of things that have to be accomplished in that 10 years. The resurrection, the judgment, which will take 1 year, and that can be demonstrated. The next year will be given over to rejoicing between Christ and his bride. There will be no preparations for war. Nothing will be done except the rejoicing of Christ with his bride to fulfill Deuteronomy 24, verse 5. When a man takes a wife, he will not be given any business. He will not go to war. He will cheer up his wife for 12 months. Hands up, brethren, anyone in this room who cheered up their wife for 12 months in their honeymoon? None of you. I had 3 days. Did any Israelite ever cheer up his wife for 12 months? No. It wasn't written for them. It's the same as the law, thou shalt not muzzle the ox that treads out the corn. Paul says that wasn't written for oxen. Does God care for oxen? No. It was written for the apostles, so that you could feed them when they did their work of proclaiming the truth. Deuteronomy 24 verse 5 wasn't written for anybody else but Christ. Nobody ever kept it. But he will. When he's glorified his bride at the end of 12 months of the judgment process, he's going to go around and meet every one of them personally. Expect Christ to come and give you a hug. That's usually what husbands do to their newly found wife. Expect him to come and give you a hug. He'll want to know all about you. That's 12 months. No preparation for war. So up to 2 years, haven't we? Yeah. And Elijah and many saints will go out 3.5 years prior to Armageddon to begin the process of warning Jews. They're going to get a sign of the Son of Man in heaven, which is Armageddon, by the way. You're going to get a sign. You can't dismiss it. Armageddon's coming. That leaves about 4 or 5 years for the preparation of the saints to do their work. It will take that length of time, brethren and sisters. Never think that an immortal is an automata. The angels are still learning. When God sends his angels on missions, now through Christ, of course, he collects them together. We've got a picture of this in the Bible. He collects them together and says, now, what do you think we should do about this? He's going to make you use your brain in the kingdom. Alright? He's going to ask for you to say, how are we going to go about this? We're going to say, that's the idea, we'll take that one and get out and do it. It's going to take 4 or 5 years to gear up all of these saints for a myriad of things that have to be done for the next 45 years. Yep, there will be a 10-year period between the resurrection of the dead and Armageddon, which is why we don't have to worry about some unfulfilled prophecies like peace for Israel and all that sort of stuff. Plenty of time, brothers and sisters. We can be at the judgment seat and all of that will be accomplished while we are there. I'm off the track, sorry. I get carried away when I get to that subject. Because it's fascinating, isn't it? You can actually nail this down. I give 8 studies on that 10 years. Imagine how many I'm going to give on the 50. 4. Took 40 studies to get through this 50-year period. And we did it back in 1979-98. It's a huge subject. Well, the reason I'm here is because this is the work of the mighty rainbowed angel, revealed at Armageddon to the world, goes on for the next 40 years. When we see him, he's at the end of his career. He's victorious. Victorious over all comers. And of course there's an intense period here of the destruction of Catholic Europe, who will oppose his rule. Who's going to do that? Well, Elijah bringing the Jews back through Europe. They're the weapon to be used against the system of Babylon the Great, overshadowed by the saints, as they will be when they come back. Now, I didn't put this through the speakers because I would have woken you all up. But if you can hear sort of thunder in the background, this is a reference to Revelation chapter 10 and verse 4, verses 3 and 4. He cried with a loud voice, as when a lion roareth, and when he had cried, 7 thunders uttered their voices. And when the 7 thunders uttered their voices, I was about to write, and I heard a voice from heaven saying unto me, seal up those things, John, and write them not. You know, some people think that that means that these judgments are so severe and so serious that you shouldn't tell anybody. They're awful. It's not about that, brothers and sisters. That's not what is meant here. It's about you and me doing what John had to do in this chapter. You know what he had to do? He was invited by the angel, this angel that he sees here, at the end of his career, he's invited by a voice to approach this angel. You read with me verse 8 of Revelation 10. And the voice, he says, which I heard from heaven spake unto me again and said, go and take the little scroll which is open in the hand of the angel which standeth upon the sea and upon the earth. Verse 9. And I went unto the angel and said unto him, give me the little scroll. And he said unto me, take it and eat it up. It shall make thy belly bitter, but it shall be in thy mouth sweet as honey. Now what's that about? Well, you see, this is the reason why he wasn't allowed to write it. He had to eat it. Don't write the contents of the scroll down. Eat the scroll. Make it your own. Alright? See the point of it? Some of you are eating now. Could I offer you some paper? This is a scroll. Anybody? Any takers? I don't think there'll be any takers. You see, the point of that is, this is something that's extraordinary. Eating a scroll, but it's not the first time it's happened, brothers and sisters. It's not the first time it's happened. And it's very important to realise that we're in the context of the end, and we know we're near the end now, when there will be time no longer, because we see this mighty angel raise his hand to heaven, raise his right hand towards heaven. There's a divine oath that there will be delay in verse 6. No longer. It's a great encouragement for believers living at the end of the 6th trumpet. Oh, mind you, another 600 years before it became a reality, there's the hope, there's the promise that's given to them. And what they're invited to do is what we're invited to do. You know, verse 7, Brother Thomas translates this way. But in the days of the voice of the 7th angel, the 7th trumpet angel is meant, when he shall sound, Brother Thomas translates, when he shall sound, doesn't say begin to sound, that is, while he's sounding, and the 7th trumpet began with the French Revolution, while he's sounding, says, the secret of God should be finished, as he hath declared to his servants the prophets. Right? The secret of God should be completed. So you see, John is asked to go and eat the scroll. As I said, this is not new. This has happened to another man who just happens to have written the book of Ezekiel. Because Ezekiel was invited to go and eat a scroll. Now, I'm not going to take you back there for the sake of time, but you can compare this. In Ezekiel 2 verse 9, he saw a scroll, the messenger's hand. In verse 2 of John, chapter 10, he saw a scroll open in the angel's hand. In Ezekiel 2 verse 10, this scroll that he saw was written both sides with divine judgments. John sees a little scroll containing the 7 thunder judgments. Ezekiel chapter 3 verse 1 was invited to eat the scroll, so was John. Revelation 10 verse 8, he found it, Ezekiel, as John did, sweet as honey in his mouth. And in verse 14 of Ezekiel 3, he experienced bitterness in the execution of what was written in that scroll. And that's exactly what John found. It was sweet in his mouth, but he found it to be bitter in his belly. What do you reckon that might mean, brothers and sisters? Well, it means this. If something is sweet in your mouth, it's agreeable, isn't it? You agree with it. You've got a scroll in which is written divine judgments. You agree with it. But in the execution of it, you're not going to find it a pleasant business at all. God desires the death of no man. We don't desire the death of any man, do we? But the judgments that are coming are going to be massive. The loss of life on this earth is going to be massive. If God's going to take 2/3 of his own people, he won't take any less Gentiles. We're looking at 4 billion people, at least, gone. Is that going to be a pleasant experience? No. Just like Ezekiel found, it will be bitter in the eating thereof, in the stomach. You know, it's a little bit like life in the truth, isn't it? We come to meetings and we sit and we listen to the Bible being expounded and we, it's sweet in our mouth. It's like eating honey, isn't it? It's not so easy when you walk out the door, is it? It's not so easy when you walk out the door. You've got to face the bitterness of life out there. You've got to try and put into practice the things that sound sweet in your mouth. That's the principle. Right? So here we've got a very important exhortation to us. You want to be involved in this work of overthrowing the evil systems of men and establishing the kingdom of God? You've got to take the scroll and eat it. You've got to make it your own. You've so desire to be there that you're prepared to go, as it were, like John did. And this is what he did. He takes the initiative. You see what it says in verse 9? I went unto the angel. And the angel didn't come to him and say to him, oh, John, open your mouth and shove the thing down his throat. He said, you come to me. And John took the initiative and he went and took the scroll and he ate it. That's the principle for you and me, brothers and sisters. You've got to want to be there, to be involved in this work. There's got to be a real desire. It's got to be sweet in your mouth, even though it will be bitter in the execution. And this is why it's going to be bitter. Have a look at Revelation 10 and verse 11. And he said unto me, thou must prophesy again before many peoples and nations and tongues and kings. Now normally, I hear people talking about that verse saying, that means we're going to preach the truth to people. Yeah, we are going to teach the truth to people. But this is not what this verse is about. And you've got to read the context. Context is always the final arbiter of any interpretation. This context is about judgment. This is about eating the scroll. This is about the bitterness that will be part of that execution. Alright? That's why Brother Thomas is quite correct. He's quite correct. In your reading, this is what he says. After John, as a representative of all the saints, had eaten up the little scroll, the judgments to be executed, when the angel of the bow shall have been developed, he was told by the angel in vision that he must prophesy again against many peoples and nations and tongues and kings. Yeah. The first work is the work of judgment. What follows is a work of education and instruction. Yeah, the time will come when we will instruct and teach. But this is not about that. This is about the judgments that have to be poured out first. And this is the way it will unfold. The 40 years of the subjugation of nations begins with Armageddon, when the Gogian host is destroyed in the land of Israel. And the Tarshish powers, we call them the Western powers today, are humbled in that same process. Then there will be a 10-year proclamation to the nations to submit. And I'll talk about that briefly a little later on. Some sensible nations like Britain and presumably America, sometimes, nations can be sensible. Britain, America, Australia, Canada, nations like that you would expect to submit to Christ. but other nations won't. The Catholic nations will unite behind the Pope. They're going to implement their Antichrist doctrine that the Jesuits invented. Yeah, it was the Jesuits who invented it. Said there will come a man who will claim to be the King of the Jews, ensconce himself in Jerusalem and demand that the world serves him. Yeah. So many peoples, unfortunately, especially the European nations, will follow the papacy in opposition to Christ. That's why you have to have another 40 years of judgment, so to speak. There'll be a lull before the final storm of 30 years. It's the hour of judgment we spoke about in Revelation chapters 17 and 18. Rome itself will be destroyed in a fiery overthrow 10 years after Armageddon. That could be demonstrated from Revelation 14 and verse 8. There will be a final plea after Rome itself goes down the gurgler. And they still won't listen, most of them. So it'll be necessary for the nations of Europe to be subject to intense wars. And it will just so happen that Elijah will have Israel in the body of Europe organised. And the saints, as it says in Zechariah 9 verse 14, shall be seen over them. Yahweh shall be seen over them. And the saints will use power, the power of the Spirit, to sweep away the armies that attempt to stop Israel returning to the land. Have nations tried to stop Israel returning to the land in the past? Yes. It's going to happen all over again. Anti-Semitism is on the rise in our world, brothers and sisters. Guess where it's mostly found? Eurasia, Russia and Europe. It's on the rise. The papal power will finally be utterly destroyed, and we can determine when that is. Even Sir Isaac Newton knew when that was. It's in his Bible. In the margin of his Bible, in Daniel chapter 7, there's a note. 2060. 2060. 2060. The demise of the papacy. Written by Sir Isaac Newton in 1750. He knew that. That's when the Pope's going down to gurgler. But not all Catholics. There's a period of cleaning up after that, Revelation 19 verse 21. But finally all nations will be subdued under Christ's rule. Now I know that I put a lot in there, but it's hugely so. It's really huge. You know, you can have a precision in your vision that can make that more real than the things you see with your eyes. Can be done. I want you to come to Revelation 14. Revelation 14 is about the triumph of the Lamb and the Redeemed. And you read in verse 1, and I looked, and lo, a lamb stood on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, having his father's name written in their foreheads. So when do you think it might be that the Lamb with the Redeemed stands on Mount Zion? Well, it's really post-Armageddon, it's post-earthquake, isn't it? It's post the complete change of the land, the exaltation of Mount Zion. It's got to be there, doesn't it? So this chapter begins with the events immediately after Armageddon. Verses 6 and 7 speak about what's going to happen then. The mid-heaven proclamation goes forth to the nations. It will last for 10 years. Verse 8 is about the destruction of the city of Rome and the Vatican, of course, which they'll try and rebuild after the events of Armageddon. Verses 9 to 11 is another warning to those who continue to adhere to papal rebellion against Christ's rule. Verse 12 is like a fulcrum in the chapter. It's the middle of the chapter, the patience of the saints. And then what happens, and this is typical of the apocalypse, you get the picture up front, and then you get the details of how it's going to all fall out. Verses 13 to 16 is Armageddon, the harvest of the earth, the explanation of how we get here. And verses 17 to 20 is the vintage of the earth, that is the crushing of Babylon the Great. Israel had a year, which is used in the scriptures, and it's used here in Revelation 14. Now this is the Jewish year. As you know, it doesn't sync with our Gregorian calendar. You know who invented the Gregorian calendar, don't you? Pope Gregory XIII, which is why it's wonky. Right? Providing you stay within it, it's fine. But it's wonky, like most calendars are wonky. And I think there's a reason for that. God doesn't want us to know the year of Christ's return. We have to wait patiently and be ready for it at any time. We know it's near. So here we've got Israel's harvest season. They harvested the crops, beginning with the barley, ending with Pentecost, 50 days later. Okay? They harvested barley and then wheat. And then there was the picking of certain fruits, the early figs, the first grapes, and the summer fruits. And then they finished it with the vintage. They picked the grapes and crushed the vintage. They trod out the vintage. That was their year. That's the language that's used in Revelation 14. So you have the harvest of the earth. You just look with me at Revelation chapter 14 and verse 15. It says this. And another angel came out of the temple, crying with a loud voice to him that sat on the cloud, "Thrust in thy sickle." What do you use a sickle for? Well, cutting down grains, don't you? "Thrust in thy sickle and reap, for the time is come for thee to reap, for the harvest of the earth is ripe." Anyone tell me what Armageddon means? Formed of three Hebrew words, Arima, Gay, Dom, or Dan. Anyone know what I mean? I think I heard it from your lips. A heap of sheaves in a valley for judgment. Yeah, Armageddon is the harvest of the earth. Right? It matches the beginning of Israel's harvest season. But Armageddon is relatively short. It's the rest of the judgments that will be long. The treading out of the winepress of the wrath of God is going to be over a period of 40 years. The vintage, and we read about that, if you have a look with me, verses 18 and 19. Another angel comes out in verse 18 of the order. His power over fire. He cries with a loud voice, "Thrust in thy sharp sickle and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for her grapes are fully ripe." And the angel thrust in his sickle into the earth and gathered the vine of the earth, cast it into a great winepress of the wrath of God. So you've got the treading out of a winepress. This is exactly in harmony with what Israel did in their harvest season. It lasted some months. Well, I want to look at verse 1 and verse 20 of Revelation 14 with you. Because we have a secret revealed here. It's the secret code of Revelation 14. Now, by the way, brothers and sisters, there's nothing new in what I'm saying. If you read Eureka, it's all there. All of this is in Eureka. It's been there for 150 odd years. So here in verse 1 of Revelation chapter 14, we have a symbolic number used. 144,000. If you're Jehovah's Witness, of course, it means something quite different to what we understand from it. If they believe 144,000 go to heaven, the rest of us poor sheep on earth, we've got to put up with being down here. Not about that at all, is it? This is a symbolic number. And it's not new. It's not new in the Apocalypse, because you see, this is all explained in chapter 7. In Revelation 7 verses 4 to 9, you have 12 tribes of Israel with 12,000 sealed. Now 12 times 12,000 is 144,000. Okay? So Revelation 7 tells you who they are. And in verse 9 it identifies them. It's not a set number of people at all. It's a vast, innumerable multitude, it says, from all nations and peoples and tongues. Yeah, it's the redeemed. It's a symbolic number. So how do we get this symbolic number? Well, you use the square root principle. Alright? 12 is the number of Israel in the Word of God, isn't it? 1,000 to a Hebrew meant a family. You want proof of that? Jot down Judges chapter 6 verse 15. Because when Gideon was approached by the angel says, you're going to destroy the Midianites. He said, who, me? You mean me? He said, I mean you. He says, my family is the least in Manasseh. Look up the Hebrew for the word family. It should be rendered, my 1,000. Now, why? Well, you see, what's the first word in the Hebrew dictionary? The first word to come from the mouth of a baby when it starts to speak. Abba, Father. number one. By the time he's finished, with children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, he's got 1,000, hasn't he? Start with a father one, you end with a family, 1,000. That's why Gideon says, my 1,000 is the least in Manasseh. To a Hebrew, you say 1,000, he interprets it as a family. So what have we got here? Well, if 12's the number of Israel, and 1,000 to a Hebrew means a family, we've got the whole family of Israel. The glorified multitude, the redeemed, who are with Christ when Mount Zion has been exalted. Got a picture? You've got to use the square root principle. 12 times 12. So if God gives you that key in verse 1, how do you interpret verse 20? The last verse of chapter 1. Well, let's have a look at it. It says this. And the winepress was trodden without the city, and blood came out of the winepress even unto the horse bridles. Now, I'll prove this to you later, that the horse here is not the Roman Empire, because this is the vehicle of judging the Roman Empire. It's another horse. And I'll prove it to you from Scripture that it's actually Israel. Israel, returning under Elijah, is the horse of Revelation 14 verse 20 and of Revelation chapter 19 verses 10 and 11, as we're going to see. But we'll prove that later on. So here you've got blood coming out of the winepress, which is being trodden out by the space of 1,600 furlongs. Now, this is not a lineal measurement. It's actually the length or the period of the bloodshed involved in treading the winepress. It's clear that that's the case. It's the length of the judgments required to get the blood, as it were, symbolically to be with the horse bridles. Well, how are we going to interpret this? 1,600. Just happens to be 40 times 40. Use the square root principle. Just happens to be 40 times 40. It's telling you that the judgments, just like Micah 7, verses 15, thereabouts, just like that, it's telling you these judgments will last for 40 years. From the time of Armageddon to the time when the system of Babylonianism is crushed completely, it will be 40 years. And the vehicle of that judgment is largely going to be Israel returning under Elijah through what's called biblically in Ezekiel 20, the wilderness of the peoples. There's only one wilderness of the peoples in the Bible. I'm going to show you that in a minute. But what follows? What follows back in chapter 14 and verses 6 and 7 of this marvellous vision from verses 1 to 5 of Christ and the redeemed on Mount Zion? Well, a proclamation. This is the next thing that happens. Verses 6 and 7. I saw another angel fly in the midst of heaven. Why do you think it talks about the midst of heaven? Well, let's use our symbols. What does heaven represent in the Apocalypse and in many places in the Word of God? Well, the heaven's up there. Let's say that the ceiling here is heaven, and down here the floor is the earth. Okay? Heaven represents government. The earth represents the peoples that the government ruled over. The Roman Empire is called the earth. They were ruled over by emperors who were sitting in the area or governing region. So if this message, and it's clearly the saints who can take this message out, if this message is going in the midst of heaven, what does that mean? Well, let me ask you a simple question. Immediately after Armageddon, we know from Psalm 2 and many other places that the Pope will assemble nations to himself and say, he's an imposter. This Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus Christ, claims to be the king, and he's an imposter. Alright? And many nations will support the papacy against Christ's rule. Careful read of Psalm 2 tells you. If the saints went out to talk to just the governments of the world and not the common people, what do you reckon the response would be? Let me ask you a question. Does President Obama tell you everything you'd like to know about what's going on in the American government? Answer, no. If the saints went to the rulers of the world who are now supporting the Pope against Christ and said, Christ demands you submit, you reckon that that those nations and their governments would tell the people that that's the message they received? Of course not. So you see, the messengers have to fly in the midst of heaven, and their proclamation is to governments and to the common people on earth. So that nobody can say, "I never heard anything about this. No one told me." No one will have an excuse. That's the reason for that. Go on to say, they fly in the midst of heaven having the everlasting gospel. This word everlasting gospel here means good news pertaining to the age, but it's only good news if you obey it. If you don't obey it, it's very bad news. And they're not preaching. This word is rendered by the RV proclaim. It's a proclamation. This is not preaching time. This is proclamation time. Saying with a loud voice, "Fear God and give glory to Him, for the hour of His judgment is come." The hour of His judgment, by the way, is that 30-year period. The hour of His judgment has come. Worship Him that made heaven and earth, etc. That's the proclamation. Now, many of the saints that are there at Mount Zion in verse 1 are going to end up being sent out by Christ. Who knows? You might be coming back to this area, to Michigan. And you'll go to the people that are ruling over this area and say, "Listen, you've got to submit." You'll go to the common people. It's going to take a while to do that, isn't it? Not many televisions then. They'll be gone. Armageddon will see that. You'll have to go to these people. So every single one of them, it's not going to take you 10 years to do it. Every single one of them's got to know. They can make their own decision. So this is the pattern of Roman Catholic resistance to Christ's rule for 40 years after Armageddon. Now he's returned 10 years prior to this event, Armageddon, to raise the dead, etc. But when Armageddon occurs, the Catholic system is going to take a dive for a while because they're fully behind the Gogi invasion. In fact, they're the thinking power, they're the Babylonian head of the image. But Psalm 2 tells us that the Pope will regather his forces and resist the rule of Christ. Why do the nations rage, says Psalm 2. Why do they assemble themselves tumultuously? I have set my king upon my holy hill of Zion. Verse 6. Alright? It's past tense. I have set. But they'll be in rebellion. That will be met 10 years later. This is the proclamation period, the mid-heaven proclamation period. And 10 years later, Revelation 14 verse 8 says that Rome goes down the girdle, along with the Pope who happens to be sitting in the Vatican at the time. They're not going to stop them. They will resort to Central Europe, which is where the Holy Roman Empire has its base. And the Scripture tells us that it's the Holy Roman Empire rebuilt, re-established, that Christ and the saints destroyed. And it will be Israel in the wilderness of the peoples, coming back under Elijah in the second Exodus, that will be used by the saints as the weapon against Babylon the Great. And in 2060, papacy is destroyed. And then there'll be a clean-up period. That clean-up period just happens to be 4 years now, and Christ comes this year. It'll be 5 years if he comes next year. 6 years if he comes in 2016. 7 years if he comes in 2017, and so on. I'll let you come to some conclusions about that. Now I want to sweep on, if I can, to chapter 17. Chapter 17. How are we going for time here? We're not doing too badly, based on the last experience. Let's press on. Chapter 17 of Revelation. Verse 1. And there came one of the 7 angels which had the 7 vials, and talked with me, saying unto me, Come hither. Why? This happens to be the 7th angel. The invitation is to John to be involved. And John is a representative man. Come hither. And to be involved. And I will show unto thee the judgment of the great whore that sitteth upon many waters. I'm going to explain this. Right? Many waters is interpreted for. I don't have to impose any interpretations on it. You just look at verse 15. The many waters of peoples, multitudes, nations and tongues. The sea is a symbol for nation, isn't it? Here you've got this woman who's described for us then, sitting upon a scarlet-coloured beast that has 7 heads and 10 horns. It's the great four, the paramour of world rulers, which that system has been. And it's brought into remembrance before God, because in her was found the blood of prophets and of saints and of all that was slain upon the earth. Yes, it's true. Well, we're sitting here, brothers and sisters. We're sitting right at the end of the 6th vial period. We're about to see the pouring out of the 7th vial of the wrath of God, and hopefully to be personally involved in it. But you see, it's already been happening. Here's your summary of Revelation 15 and 16. I'm not going to go to chapter 15, but you get your final vision up front, so to speak, of peace coming to the earth, and then you get the way it's brought to pass. This is an apocalyptic approach. Give the first vision up front and then tell people how you get there. This is what happens in chapter 15 and 16. Chapter 16 we read, the first vial is the French Revolution. The second, Britain keeping Napoleon in Europe that he might bring judgment upon Catholicism. The third, Napoleon's Alpine victories. The fourth and the fifth were the work of Napoleon as well. But then we're now down here in the 6th vial. It began in 1820 with the drying up, the beginning of the drying up of the great Turkish Empire, with the activity of the unclean spirits that lead the nations to Armageddon. And it will culminate in the 7th vial, in the conquest of the nations. It can't be very far away. And when that happens, brothers and sisters, the French Revolution that began the pouring out of the vials of the wrath of God will culminate in the 3rd great earthquake that we read in Revelation chapter 16 and verse 18. When Babylon the Great comes in remembrance before God to receive the judgments of which that system is worthy. So here's your picture of the vials of the wrath of God that will bring judgments, or have brought judgment, beginning in 1789. Now the 6th vial began in 1820. You might ask the question, why has there to be a longer period? Look at these vials. 89, 93, 96, 1805, 1820. Short periods. Why a long period for the 6th vial? Or Revelation 17 tell me. Revelation 17. I want you to read with me verse 16. It says this. And the 10 horns, this is 10 European nations formed by the barbarian invasions that we referred to earlier today. The 10 horns which thou sawest upon the beast, these shall hate the whore, and shall make her desolate, and naked, and shall eat her flesh, and burn her with fire. When did they do that? Well, they did it in the beginning of the French Revolution, didn't they? They rose up and they cast off Catholicism. They hated the whore. They destroyed the system in Europe. So you see, this is why the 6th vial's got to be a longer period. Because you then read this in Revelation 17, verse 17. For God hath put in their hearts to fulfill his will, and to agree, and to give their kingdom unto the beast, until the words of God shall be fulfilled. Yep, God's had to work for the last 200 years, or thereabouts, to bring these nations, these European powers, who cast off the papal system in the events of the French Revolution and beyond, to bring them to a time when they will give their power unto the beast. Have a look with me at verse 12. Revelation 17, verse 12. And the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. How long's an hour in the apocalypse? 30 years. Yes, the last 30 years of that 40-year period of judgment. That's why this 6th vial had to be much longer. It had to bring these European nations who hated Catholicism back into her embrace. I don't need to tell you that's happening, and it's happening right now. Prophecy, brothers and sisters and friends, is the mould into which history is formed. That's why the fulfilment of the apocalypse is so accurate. The angels are out there ensuring that it happens exactly the way that God said it would. Prophecy is the mould into which history is poured. Let me give you one example. The sixth vial in which we find ourselves. This was the Turkish Empire in 1680. Relatively huge, isn't it? The Great River Euphrates, it's called in Revelation 16 and verse 12. The Great River Euphrates. Why? Because the Euphrates has its headwaters in Turkey. And the Euphrates floods, doesn't it? It floods, like it says in Isaiah 8 verse 7, over all its banks. That's exactly what the Turkish Empire did. It spread out over all of the area around it. But that's Turkey today. It's been dried up, considerably dried up. And it was done in ancient times. The Euphrates was dried up in ancient times by a man called Cyrus. Alright? Who we are told is a type of Christ. Raised up from the east by Yahweh in righteousness. God's shepherd to deliver Israel and appointed judge of Babylon. What did he do? Well, he dried up the Euphrates. In accordance with the prophecy of Isaiah 44, I will dry up thy rivers. I will open before him the two-leaved gates, and the gates shall not be shut. On the night that Belshazzar was drinking from the vessels of the temple, we just read it in our readings, things happened, didn't they? That was all typical of things that have happened in our era of time. Our Lord Jesus Christ has been sending forth his angels to dry up the great river Euphrates. What for? Well, Revelation 16 tells us what for. Because it says in Revelation 16 and at verse 12, the sixth angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates, the Turkish Empire in symbol, and the water thereof was dried up, that the way of the kings who are out of the sun's rising, that's how that should be rendered, might be prepared. Yes, the Turks were pushed out of Palestine by the British in 1917. Why? Because there had to be a land of Israel. Had to be a partial return of Israel. What's that land going to be used for? As a way. And Christ will have the centre of his operations. Once he's established himself in Zion, that becomes the centre of his operations against what? Against Babylon. To destroy the heart. So what you have in history was actually prophecy. Talking about what you and I have been observing for the last 200 years. And that land of Israel is about to become a way. A way to be used, just like the bed of the dry Euphrates. A way against Babylon to overthrow that system. Now I want to finish this session by just doing a couple of things to prove that we're not talking through our hat. Here is the mind that hath wisdom, says Revelation chapter 17, identifying the woman and the seven heads of the beast of verse 3. Verse 9, the seven heads are seven mountains upon which the woman sitteth. Rome was built on seven hills. Verse 10, there are seven kings. Rome had seven forms of government in its history. Verse 18, and the woman which thou sawest is that great city which reigneth over the kings of the earth. Which city was reigning over the kings of the earth when John received his vision? Well, it's obvious, isn't it? It's very important to point out that this word in the Greek, which reigneth, happens to be in the present tense. Present tense, meaning what was happening then, when John received it, which has kingship. There was only one power ruling over the nations of the earth when John received the apocalypse, and that was Rome. So there's your identification. Seven hills of Rome on the coins. There's Vespasian, by the way. Seven hills. Rome, sitting on seven rocks there. Seven forms of government. 5 are fallen, we read in verse 10. 5 had passed by the time that AD 96 came along. When John received the apocalypse, I don't know what's happening here, this is given out of pure. When John received the apocalypse, it was the imperial that was in power. And it was replaced by the Gothic that we spoke of earlier. But it's the imperial that has to be revived, to be destroyed by Christ. And this is the system that will be destroyed. Ancient harlots displayed their name on their forehead. It says in Revelation 17 verse 5, and upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. The popes once had the word mystery on their papal tiara. Harlots used to do that. Rome proclaims herself as the mother and mistress of all the churches, the Mater Ecclesia. That's just to the right hand. You stand at the Vatican, just to the right hand on the papal apartments. 10 horns are 10 European kings. And as we said, brothers and sisters, the reason for that, and I'll just go back flick here, you've got Daniel 7, 10 horns, Daniel 2, 10 toes, Revelation 13, 10 crowned horns. It's common, isn't it? That's where it comes from. 10 horns that hate the horde. French Revolution. It's going to take a long time. The Pope got his temporal power back in some measure in 1929 when Il Duce gave him 100 acres, becoming the Vatican State. The European Union was formed in 57, 6 nations under the tutelage of the Pope. At the time, the destruction of that system is coming. They sat there and put together the European Economic Community, now known as the European Union. They sat there in the camp of Dogwood. And this power can now say, I sit a queen and have no widow. God has put it in their hearts to give their power unto the beast. Now I think I might stop there, John. I was going to talk about the second Exodus and that sort of thing, but I think that's probably enough for this session. You've got a bit of a feel for what that section is about. But I'm going to finish on this note. Revelation 17 and verse 14. These shall make war. This is the 10 kings with the beast. They will make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb, Christ, shall overcome them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful. So, brothers and sisters and friends, if you approach the angel and say to him, so to speak, give me that scroll, I want to be involved. And that's what makes your heart beat, and that becomes your entire objective in life, to be there in that day. This is where you're going. You're going to be involved in the overthrow of that system. Abraham was called out of Ur the Chaldees, out of Babylon. Abraham was chosen by God. And Abraham's going to become the heir of the world by faith. These are called, chosen, and faithful.